sPlatform.
My guest tonight is international human rights lawyer, award-winning author of East West Street, Professor Phillipe Sands. Most recently, he represented Palestine before the International Court of Justice, advocating for its right to self-determination and statehood. Professor Phillipe Sands, lovely to meet you.
Sonali, it's wonderful to be with you.
Is international law failing? We live in a world where there is normalization of the flouting of international law principles. Perpetrators are being rewarded for these violations.
I think it's fair to say that aspects of international law are not in good shape. Many rules of international law work perfectly well. Communications, satellites, flights, transports, food. The rules-based system here works pretty well. But when you get to war, occupation, treatment of human beings and the environment, I think particularly are areas where we have a major problem. And as you suggest, we're in a moment of, one might call it an age of impunity, whether it is arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court, Mr. Putin or Mr. Netanyahu or leaders of Hamas, or it is a new American president who has been convicted for crimes but nevertheless is elected president of the United States. It raises some pretty fundamental questions about whether we've reached a point where the rules-based system at the national and international levels is creaking to the point we need to ask ourselves the question, where do we go next?
You've worked on some of the most high-profile cases pertaining to violations of international human rights law. Speak to us about some of the key moments and findings that you've had on this journey.
I mean, just as we're living in a difficult moment, I've been privileged to be involved in cases which offer hope. So back in 1998, when I was much younger, I was counsel in the case involving the question of whether a former head of state who commits international crimes, Augusto Pinochet of Chile, is entitled to claim immunity. And I'll never forget the moment in which the House of Lords in the Palace of Westminster gave its judgment, and by 3 judges to 2 said, no, you commit international crimes, you torture, you disappear people, you commit crimes against humanity, no immunity, no impunity. Equally, much more recently, 5 years ago, in a case I was doing for Mauritius against the United Kingdom, the World Court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, ruled in effect unanimously that the United Kingdom's continued colonization of a part of the territory of Mauritius, not so far from where we are in the Indian Ocean, the Chagos Archipelago, was illegal under international law. Britain must leave forthwith. The Mauritian and British governments have now negotiated an agreement to comply with international law. So those are bright spots, which frankly keep me going.
Juxtaposed with that, we also have the moments of hopelessness that we are surrounded by. Across the world, we see an increasing societal desensitization of grief, of pain, of harm, of suffering, and a lack of accountability.
I mean, one of the things that I've learned, I've done cases involving the most terrible international crimes for more than 30 years. And so I've seen terrible things, I've seen many mass graves. I always try to step back and empathize with anyone who's on the receiving end of horror, whichever community they are part of. So the victims of October the 7th in Israel, elderly people, women, children who are not combatants, I feel empathy for them. Children, women, elderly people who are not combatants in Gaza, I feel empathy for. Right now, in these very days that we're meeting, you mentioned the Palestine case I was involved in at the International Court of Justice. The court ruled very clearly that Israel's occupation of parts of Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza, was illegal under international law. The Palestinian people had a right to self-determination, to decide their own future direction, just as Sri Lanka did many decades ago. And then a few months on, what do we have? An American president who declares publicly, not just once, but twice, Palestinians should be cleared out of Gaza and the Americans should take over and essentially build shopping malls and beaches. I mean, it's so utterly disgraceful. And what we see here is the country that basically gave us the modern rules-based system, that drafted the UN Charter, that drafted the rules on against ethnic cleansing, against crimes against humanity, against genocide, turning its back on its own rules. So this is a grave and serious moment.
You mentioned that we have a rules-based system, but the question arises, who makes the rules and what are these rules?
Absolutely. Essentially, in simple terms, the rules-based system that we have today is one that was inherited from 1945, and it was created basically by a small number of countries, the colonial powers. Most countries had not achieved their independence. The great majority of countries were not involved in the design of the international architecture or of the rules that we live with today. And it's plain that the rules-based system, which I'm very committed to as an ideal, is not fit for purpose. And so the question that comes next, exactly as you put it, is who develops the next set of rules, which is going to be states, and what are the rules going to be? And that, of course, is up for grabs. Will we have rules protecting against climate change? Will we have rules giving individuals human rights? Will we have rules protecting groups from mass atrocity? I think right now, in this moment of gross impunity, those are reasonable questions to ask. But I've got to say that over the long term, as my writings suggest, I think the arc of history is in a rules-based order direction. And although justice is not done instantly, the quest for justice continues and will always continue. It's part of our sense of humanity, a sense of who we are.
The power-based systems are also Eurocentric. We are essentially used to a colonizer's way of doing things. How do we decolonize the mold?
Well, I think the world of international justice is lopsided. It's imbalanced. And the colonial legacy continues to operate. So let me just give one hard example. Your viewers will be aware of a body called the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's a separate court from the International Court of Justice. It has power to exercise jurisdiction on war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of genocide. Until very recently, every single person who had been indicted was black and from Africa. And you know what? Black people and African people don't have a monopoly on international criminality. Nothing on American crimes in Afghanistan, nothing on British crimes in Iraq, for example. So that has been the subject of a lot of attention by many people, which I've strongly supported. And there's been a slight change of direction. Along comes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and hey, the International Criminal Court all of a sudden can issue an indictment against some white people, and they happen to be Russian. And what happens? The US Congress celebrates, supports the ICC because they're going against Russia, the other. And a few months later, the International Criminal Court issues indictments for Israel-Palestine. 3 individuals from Hamas, 2 individuals from Israel. And what happens? The West goes ballistic. The Americans, the British, say, oh, well, hang on a second. Yes to Putin, no to Netanyahu. It's a lopsided system. And so we have a long ways to go in creating a system that truly is, if any system is capable of doing that, neutral, colorblind, nationality blind, gender blind, if you see what I mean, and is able to do justice for anyone who commits an international crime. The great French writer Balzac once wrote, "The law is like a spider's web. It catches the little flies, but the big flies get through." And that's how international law sort of works in these areas.
Wow. You speak about the formulation of international crimes in your award-winning book, East-West Street, which raises questions. Speak to us about that.
So I got an invitation, it was April 2010, and I got an invitation to give a lecture in the Ukrainian city of Lviv, which I'd never heard of. But it turned out that Lviv used to be called Lemberg when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Lvov when it was part of Poland, all the same city.
Okay.
And of course, I learned that my grandfather was born in this city. So I get excited, I'll accept the lecture invitation, not because I want to give a lecture, but because I want to really find the house where my grandfather was born, which I do. But I then discover that this is the city in which the two men who invented the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide lived and studied in the early part of the 20th century. And my book, East-West Street, tells the story of those three men and a fourth man, Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, and ends up in the famous Nuremberg trial. So I've been immersed as a practitioner, as a barrister, doing cases on genocide, for example. But this was the first time as a writer, and I've come to understand and worry the invention of the concept of genocide, which only happened in 1944 in November, very recent, may give rise to the very thing it was intended to protect. Why do I say that? The heart of the crime of genocide is about the protection of groups. The heart of crimes against humanity is about the protection of individuals. And I've come to see that the definition in law of the crime of genocide, the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part, requires you to prove that intention. And in proving that intention, there is a sort of psychological reinforcement of the hatred of the victim group against the perpetrator group and the perpetrator group against the victim group. And I've come to worry that by putting the protection of groups, casting it in cement into the international legal order, we're giving rise to more intergroup hatred rather than less. And this is something I worry about a lot.
Okay. So is a reformation of the law what we need to be looking at? Because oftentimes we see that we revisit the law after disaster strikes or when something unusual takes place.
In short, Sonali, the reformation of the law is undoubtedly needed. If you just look at the composition of the Security Council, the 5 permanent members. Fine, in 1945 you could see why Britain and France were permanent members. In 2025, what sense does it make? So yes, we need reformation, but I've come to understand that if you look back on the history of international law, you need a disaster to happen. We then pick up the pieces, we rebuild on the basis of what came before. And I fear that we're now on the path to disaster, that there will be a more general collapse. And at that point, unlike 1945, where only a small number of countries participated in the construction of a new legal order, the next time it happens, there will be more countries around, and it'll be a different cast of characters.
Okay.
We've seen some countries becoming more powerful, some countries becoming less powerful, and that will reflect itself in the design of the new rules-based order. I'm sure that will happen.
Okay. But then, Professor, after the Holocaust, we heard of never again, but here we are, againing.
Yes. You're right, Sonali. 1945 was a crucial moment. I mean, new crimes were invented. The crime of aggression, waging an illegal war. The crime of genocide, killing people as a group. crimes against humanity, killing individuals in large numbers. And Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor, stood before the judges at Nuremberg and said, never again. Well, we know, and you know in Sri Lanka, the law is there, but the law of itself cannot stop terrible things from happening. We've had laws against murder, we've had laws against rape. They have not stopped terrible things continuing to happen. So I think to keep myself going, I somehow persuade myself that it's a long game, that we're in the early stages. You know, I draw my inspiration from a colleague when I was a very young academic at Cambridge University in the 1980s. His name was Sir John Baker. He was professor in English legal history. And occasionally he would invite me for lunch. And he'd say over lunch, Phillipe, what are you working on? And I'd tell him what I was working on, and he'd stroke his little beard, and he'd say, yes, we had a similar problem in English law in 1472, and it took 273 years to sort it out. And I think that's where we are. It's a long game.
Right.
One step forward, one step back, another step forward, one step sideways. That doesn't provide solace, comfort, or protection to people who are on the receiving end of horror today, whether it's in Ukraine or Sudan or Israel or Gaza or anywhere else. But it allows us to imagine over the longer term a better aspiration. And I think I am an optimistic person. I do want to try to keep hopeful. And with my students, even in these difficult times, even as we have these, grotesque violations of international law by, people around the world, we have to hope for a better direction.
Absolutely. But this also entails the reawakening of social consciousness.
Yes. And to be honest, I had a change of direction in 2003.
Okay.
So 20 years ago. I was a very happy academic and part-time practitioner. And then the war in Iraq happened.
Right.
And I was very against the war in Iraq. I thought it was illegal and it was wrong. And I went on a march in London with my wife and our three very young children. They were, 4 and 7 and 9 or something then. And we saw there were 2 million people on the streets of London. It was incredible. British people don't go on marches, so this was very rare. And they were carrying, a lot of them, homemade placards. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter against war, illegality of war, so on and so forth. And I thought, this is really interesting. This is ordinary folk protesting for the rule of law in international relations. And so I decided then and there that I would start writing different kinds of books. I would write a book on the illegality of the war for public readership. That was called Lawless World. I would write a book on torture at Guantanamo. That was called Torture Team. And then I wrote East-West Street, which took me to a completely different audience because it got translated into 35 languages and sold a huge number of copies. And there aren't a huge number of international lawyers around the world. And what has excited me about the reaction to my books is that regular folk understand what I'm writing about. They understand that we need rules. And we come back to what you and I talk about. Who makes the rules? What is the content of the rules? What happens when the rules don't work and there's impunity? What do we do about it? Those are the questions of our day. And it's going to be the younger generation who's going to help repair the mess, frankly, my generation has left behind.
Beautiful. Professor, I'm reminded of Professor Echele Hart's The Concept of Law. And I remember this instance where he brings in a Martian looking down at Earth at the traffic light system working. And it gets him wondering, why do people obey these rules? Do we do it out of fear of punitive sanction? Do we do it because we are essentially inherently good? And isn't there a disconnect societally?
I think it comes back to our sense of individual relationship with a community, the group and the individual. You and I, with our very different backgrounds, are individuals, but we're also parts of a community. We're also parts of groups. And we've understood that to allow groups to function as a group and to function with other groups, we need an understanding of how to do that. And whether it is a rule founded in morality or religious belief or the legal order, most reasonable people would understand, as human beings, we need instruments to guide us on how we behave. What's right, what's wrong, what can be done, what can't be done. As you would talk about HLA Hart and the Martian descending on our planet, what I was thinking was, yes, absolutely, the traffic light system. But can you imagine how we've divided ourselves up? We've taken this globe, we've divided it into basically 200 bits of the world and said, these are countries, these are states. All of them have sovereignty and can do whatever they want within their own boundaries, subject to the limits of international law. But across boundaries, they have to interact lawfully with others. But the whole idea of statehood, it's completely artificial. I mean, the whole idea of the boundaries we have created, Sri Lanka as a state, the United Kingdom as a state, it's sort of bonkers. It's not part of a natural order, the way Africa has been divided up. The divisions between what we call Russia and what we call Ukraine, the divisions between what we call Israel and what we call Palestine, they're completely artificial. They're man-made. And a Martian would look at this and say, this is very peculiar, how we have organized ourselves. Is there not a better way to organize ourselves? Why don't we just do away with all of these boundaries and countries and just say, everyone is a citizen of the world? That's another type of way of organizing ourselves. Now, some people would say that's crazy. I don't want to be a citizen of the world. I want to be a citizen of Sri Lanka or the United Kingdom or Ireland or whatever it is. We need to not take for granted the legal order that we have at the national level or at the international level. And that's part of what I've tried to do in my books, get people thinking about, why do we have these rules? How do they work? What are the unintended consequences? And how can we improve our situation?
My last two questions to you, I'd love to know your perspectives on the practical application of transitional justice. We are told of the four pillars of transitional justice, of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. However, Sri Lanka is emerging from a post-conflict situation. We see this across the world. When you're the aggrieved party, it looks quite different.
But this is a huge topic, and it's a huge topic in Sri Lanka and in many countries. It's a huge topic in the United Kingdom in relation to Northern Ireland. I've spent 35, 40 years now involved in the international justice system, and I'm very careful not to dispense, diktats about what any particular community or country should do. I've come to understand every situation is particular. You need to be deeply immersed in the history and to respect how each community, how each culture has worked. But the one common theme that emerges on the horrors I have dealt with in Europe, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, elsewhere, is say nothing is not a solution. My next book, which is a sequel to East-West Street, it's called 38 Londres Street, Calle Londres 38 in Spanish. It's a street address of a city called Santiago in a country called Chile. And it's where many people were taken to be tortured and disappeared. And the book looks at the effect of disappearance over 50 years, something I've come across in many of my cases. And I've come to understand that say nothing is not an option. I'm not saying you have to have criminal proceedings or necessarily truth and reconciliation. You have to do something. I know from my own family story, my grandfather lost 80 people from his family between 1939 and 1945. He was the only survivor of a very large and extended family. And he passed in complete silence. He never talked to me as his grandchild or my brother. We never talked about these things. And yet they were present and they were there. And when I was 50 and I was asked to go to Lviv, I seized on this moment because I wanted to know, who were these people? What happened? We have to address these issues. We have to talk about them. I've come to a point, you know, Sonali, I've come to a point where I ask myself the question, how do we deal with the past and the horrors of the past? One way is criminal proceedings, but it's only ever going to be in relation to a very small number of people. And I've started to ask myself the question, what about other ways of doing justice? What about literature? Books. You have many wonderful novelists who've written about some of the terrible things that have happened in this country. It's the same in Chile. The role of the novelist in telling stories about disappearances and other things is huge. And I've come to ask myself the question, if I had to choose between a single judgment and a single book to tell a story about some act of horror that's happened somewhere in the world, what would I choose? And it's not automatically clear to me that the judgment is going to be more helpful than a fine act of writing. In telling a story, essentially the point of connection between a judgment of a court and a novel or a work of literary non-fiction is that it's telling a story. And as humans, we love, love, love stories. And I think the heart of transitional justice is telling a story. A grandparent telling a grandchild, a novel, a judgment, it's all part of the same thing.
Beautiful. Professor, how do you continue to be aspirational? How do you continue to have hope? How do you continue to believe in the goodness of humanity despite seeing the worst of humanity on a day-to-day basis?
It is true that I've come across horrible things, and somehow I remain both reasonably grounded and I have a belief in the human condition. There are human beings who do terrible things in every society. I believe probably even I'm capable under certain conditions of doing terrible things. I try to listen, I try to engage. I've become very good friends, for example, with a man called Nicholas Frank, whose father was hanged at Nuremberg for the murder of 4 million human beings. Pause for a moment. Can you imagine what it's like to have a dad who is hanged at Nuremberg for the murder of 4 million human beings? Nicholas despises his father, and we've become very good friends. He's a good man. And people find it strange that I could be so close a friend of the son of so terrible a Nazi, so terrible a man. But we are friends, and that's what I think is important. I'm blessed with an incredible family, incredible friends, and every day I meet amazing people like you and many of the people who are here in Galle at this festival. People who've been through terrible things, some of them, and yet have survived, have prospered, have become storytellers or writers or lawyers even. And I think that, in short, the decency of many of the people that I've met, including especially young people. I love teaching. I love being in the classroom. You know, you've been in a classroom. You know what it's like. There is this special energy when you're a student at school, at university, that you can change the world.
The hopefulness,
Yes. That has to be encouraged. That has to be encouraged. It's a wonderful thing.
Beautiful. Professor Phillipe Sands, thank you
It's great
for
to be with
this
you.
absolutely beautiful conversation.
Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.
The People's Platform. Dit was ICC Champions Trophy ක්‍රිකට් තරගාවලියේ අවසන් මහා තරගය ඉන්දියාව සහ නවසීලන්තය අතර ඉරිදා සවස 2:30ට TV1 ඔස්සේ සජීවීව www.sirasatv.lk වෙබ් අඩවි ඔස්සේද නැරඹිය හැක.
The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome. My next guest tonight is a British Ghanaian author, filmmaker, journalist and professor. I'm so delighted to welcome to the studio Afua Hirsch. She's the Sunday Times best-selling author of British and also most recently Decolonizing My Body, a radical exploration of rituals and beauty. Afua, welcome to Sri Lanka and to the show.
Thank you, Sonali. It's a pleasure.
From a young age, we are told of the world from a Eurocentric point of view, and unlearning toxic and harmful conceptions of the world as we know it, of history as we know it, is so harmful. And that process is also an individual one, an individualistic one. And firstly, it starts from decolonizing our own body. I'd like you to, as a precursor to this conversation, take us through what your journey was like in learning to decolonize your body.
Thank you so much for the question. It's actually so interesting how you frame it, because that's, I think, how it should be, that it should start with decolonizing your body. For me, it happened the other way around.
Okay.
And what happened was that as a journalist and an author, a professor, somebody who is very curious about the world and analytical, I started to really unpick the legacies of colonialism as history, as economics, as contemporary politics, how these histories still affect us, how race and gender and age, culture, faith are still operating to have such unequal outcomes in society. But it was very much an exterior analysis. I was looking at the world outside. I was breaking down phenomena in the world. And it took me until this book to realize that actually those ideas that I was applying to our political systems and our socioeconomic experiences, I wasn't applying to my own body. I recognized the toxicity of systems of race and power and the legacy of colonialism in the world outside, but I was still applying those really toxic ideas to the way I felt about myself as a woman, as a black woman, as a woman who's getting older. And when I saw the distance that existed between my head and my relationship with my body, I realized that I really needed to act. And this book is the journey that I went on to apply that thinking to myself and the really radical experience that it led me to.
As women, as brown-skinned women, as black-skinned women, we grow up hating ourselves, hating our bodies, wanting to pander to a Eurocentric notion and conception of beauty. Little girls grow up wanting to look a certain way. How do you look at this?
I think for a lot of my life, I looked at this as some kind of individual failing, and I think it happens to a lot of us. First, I experienced that self-loathing and the pain and frustration that I didn't conform to these Eurocentric beauty standards. Then when I started to understand that better, I blamed myself for not loving the way I was, for not having self-acceptance. And really, this book is explaining that it's not your fault. It's not some weakness on your part. It's not an oversight. This was built by design. These are ideas that have been marketed and bombarded us through social media, through traditional media, through entertainment, through fashion and beauty. They are raising us, conditioning us to buy certain products, offer us the chance to change our appearance through consumerism. through cosmetics, now through surgeries and cosmetic interventions. And, these things drive the economy. They keep us in the bondage of constant dissatisfaction and unhappiness. They also keep us passive. I think as women, so much of our headspace is devoted to feeling unhappy with our bodies, trying to change it, starving ourselves, or trying to buy things or change the way we look, that we're not actually able to tap into our real power. And I think for us to really achieve self-love is very threatening to the status quo. So I think it helps if we stop looking at this as some individual problem and recognize this is a system. It was built by design to operate this way. And if we want to change it, we have to actively counter that system. And the way that I started countering the system was through knowledge. I didn't know the alternative way of being, even though it's in my own culture and ancestry. When I look back into the past of the traditional knowledge systems that my own female ancestors were using, they were the complete counter to these ideas. And for example, the cult of youth that Europe has promoted through the world is an anathema to almost every indigenous culture I've studied. To stay alive, to survive is an accomplishment. It's celebrated. It was acknowledged in all indigenous societies that as a woman, as you got older, you had more to offer in wisdom, in service, through knowledge, survival. It's something that is seen as the value that you have to offer. And in many cultures, that's still the case. But I grew up in Britain in a society that regards aging as a complete failure. You become less desirable, less useful, less attractive. And so then you become consumed with trying to change it. And it's such a setup. The one thing that's going to happen to all of us is that we age. If you're persuaded that aging is bad, then you are guaranteed to have a life of unhappiness. And when you really see it like that, it doesn't make any sense. So I needed to find an alternative that was grounded in something I can relate to because it's in my own past. And I really encourage other people to do the same because we have millennia of history that offers a complete alternative. And it's only really since colonial times that we've been persuaded to all assimilate into one worldview. And it's not good for anyone. It's not good for European women. It's not good for women of color. It's not good for anyone, and it's not benefiting us.
If we were to closely look at this through a gendered lens, across time, throughout history, women have been suppressed, subjugated, women's agency has been taken away from them. And in the present day, we see this happening through Ozempic. We see this happening through coercive control. Recently, the most recent incident of Kanye West and his partner Bianca Censori. The sheer power imbalance and how shockingly scary it was for a man in power to parade his partner who he's supposed to love and honor
and protect
for the world to see. And that dynamic of taking vulnerability and throwing it in your face. There is no safety there. These are shocking things that we have to watch and not do anything about because we just can't. Our hands are tied. But through our omission, through our silence, we are collectively complicit.
I agree. I mean, I'm a writer, so my response to that was to write. And that there are so many things, and you beautifully articulated what was so disturbing about that. But, something that really relates to my book is, I think, the pornification of the female body. Nudity and eroticism is not inherently sexual. It's a tradition of these things being spiritual, them being a form of protest, and being connected to female power. In this current society, a woman's body has been commoditized into an item that is used to over-sexualize us, to reduce our power, to make relationships with women transactional. And I felt that this was a really good example of how that's being weaponized, and it's being weaponized by men. I mean, it's rare that you see something like as visceral as a man literally parading his partner out while he's fully clothed, telling her to undress, coercing her into that moment of vulnerability. Vulnerability requires safety. And on so many levels, that was not safe. And I think you're right. I think this poses a real question, like when an, in theory, consenting adult is being abused or controlled in plain sight, what do? We don't have an adequate response. as a society. And part of that is because we've become very used to being complicit in that kind of abuse. I mean, the reason that we've had a Me Too movement is because it was so normalized for years for women to be abused in that way, to be exploited, that people were persuaded that it was just part of doing your job, part of the business. And I think the positive change is that now we are talking about it. We are calling it out. We are giving language and voice to the kind of abuse we're seeing. But for me, it does go deeper into the whole culture of women's bodies, of fashion, of attractiveness, of beauty. And the reality is that as a woman, you get rewarded for being sexualized. You get rewarded in the culture in the sense that you get offered endorsements and invited onto red carpets. You fill media space, your celebrity rises. And I think that, you know, even if you are consenting to that behavior, is it really something you'd choose if you were given a blank slate? Or are you pressured into it by the economic and aesthetic standards that we live in?
Afua, when we speak about breaking the patterns of learned behavior, we see how a lot of young women are moving towards decentering men, not pandering to the male gaze. And this is the most liberating thing that one can do for oneself. Speak to us about the importance of centering one's own self in one's journey as a woman.
I think for me, this book was all about reclaiming my narrative about beauty, attractiveness, value, desire, defining my own standards, because for much of my life, those standards have been dictated to me by the media, by industries that have created these ideas, and then I have felt pressure to conform to them. By reclaiming that and just defining, what do I regard as attractive, successful, useful? What histories do I want to connect with? What aesthetic traditions speak to me? That's an act of personal reclamation that is not just individualistic. It taps into communities and the histories, but it restores my agency and my ability to choose. And I think a huge part of that is also stripping away the male gaze, that, you know, your body and your appearance, the rituals you conduct, the rites of passage you experience cannot be dictated by anyone external to yourself. But so many of us have formed our relationship with our bodies to seek approval from society, from patriarchal societies, which always center the male gaze. I do think that we are at a moment where, you know, we can sit here on TV and have this conversation, that we are all becoming fluent in a language that, if we haven't solved the problem, we're at least becoming much more sophisticated at identifying and articulating it. And that really is the first stage to change. So I feel hopeful about that. And, you know, I have a 13-year-old daughter. When I look at the way she dresses, it's so different from how I wanted to dress at that age. I wanted to cater, even at such a young age, I wanted to cater to these ideas of sexiness that I was seeing in the pop stars and the models that I admired. My daughter and her friends want to be comfortable. Yeah. They want to be comfortable. They talk about a soft life and they wear all these baggy clothes. And, you know, I'm not saying they're immune from the same influences, but there's a level of control that they feel entitled to feel comfortable in their bodies and in their clothes. And it didn't occur to me that was something I could choose at that age. So I think we are seeing progress, and we are seeing girls who are unapologetic about expressing their own identity and finding their own voice. And that really does fill me with optimism.
Yes, yes, it does. But I'd like to juxtapose that optimism with the aesthetic that is connected to economic survival, acceptance, to consumerism, capitalism that we see in and around the world. We see on television almost a dystopian ideal of beauty that women have to subject themselves to. And I want to specifically speak about the resistance to age as one would like to, age as men are allowed to. Why are we creating norms that are so disconnected from self-worth and self-love? And it's not just ordinary human beings. These are very influential women of power that we are talking about across the world.
Yeah, I mean, when you say we're creating them, we are not creating them. I don't think women are creating these norms. I definitely don't think brown women are creating these norms. I think you can look at the history. I mean, even if you look at pre-Christian Europe, there were also indigenous traditions that celebrated the female body through tattooing and ritual with age. And there's a moment in time you can isolate when the Christian church decided that the power that comes with a woman loving and celebrating her aging body is a threat to a patriarchal system of power. And that was deliberately crushed. And that this demonization of the older woman, the taboos around aging, around being unapologetic about your age, were created by patriarchal systems to control women. If you allow women to tap into their power, you can't centralize that, you can't control it, you can't harness it. And so and then of course those European norms were globalized through colonialism, through religious evangelism, through fashion and media, now through Silicon Valley enterprise. I mean, these ideas have been repeated, but they come very deliberately from a cynical and power-based idea about crushing the autonomy of women. So I think it's important to understand that. And, you know, I say all this not to judge women. I have friends in LA who are actors who hide their age. You know, I have a friend who's in her mid-40s. The casting director still thinks she's in her 20s. And the reason for that is not self-loathing. It's because if they knew her age, she would no longer be cast as a leading woman. She'd now be cast as the mother or of the aunt. And, you know, the predominantly male screenwriters who create these roles are not making the mother or the aunt the interesting character with a lot of lines and scenes. Yeah. They are the peripheral character. It's the young woman who conforms to those ideas about attractiveness and sexuality who gets the leading role. And so for my friend, that's a matter of economic survival. It's a matter of her income, that she has to try and hide her real age. She has to restrict what she eats and drinks so that she can try and preserve the perception of her youth. And so I think once those power systems exist, many of us don't have necessarily the choice as to whether we conform to them. And so I'm not saying that as a woman you need to forget what people think and just let your hair be grey, express your age, never have any cosmetic surgery done. I recognize that many of us are doing that almost as a rational response to the economic system that we live in. But we can't change that system unless we start to identify exactly what that is and how it's working. And if we don't start to call it out and we don't start to reclaim that power. And, you know, no one person can do that on their own. But I wrote this book as a way of saying, as a woman who is in the public gaze and in the media, who would benefit from also assimilating to those ideas, I'm deliberately taking a stand not to, and I'm willing to pay the price of that because I believe that assimilating into it is not going to lead to a better future. And we need a better future as a matter of increasing urgency.
We are oftentimes averse to embracing ancient wisdoms that come from our own ancestors. We seem to sometimes have an internalized hatred or reluctance to accept our South Asianness or blackness. How do we decipher a way out of this maze of thoughts and understandings?
I think that a lot of it is actually knowledge. You know, I think that there's a maybe complacency that if you grow up in a certain culture or with parents and grandparents, you know that culture. In my case, I mean, many of us are displaced into diaspora, but even if you're not, colonialism has diluted or erased many parts of that heritage. And for me, really seeking knowledge about what that heritage is, what did my female ancestors believe in, what were their practices, what were their rituals? No, in writing this book, I went through, for my daughter, a puberty ritual to celebrate her beginning of her menstruation. That's something that's not been done in my family for generations.
Right.
And you know, in a way, it was uncomfortable for people in my family that we moved away from those things. There's still a perception that that belongs to some kind of primitive past.
Right.
And for me, it was so important. When I started my period, no one explained what it meant for my body, what it meant for my psychology, that I was embarking on this period that would also be finite, because of course, at the other side, you go through menopause. That there's a power attached to having a cycle and having the power of fertility. And, you know, you can't really build a authentic relationship with that if you don't understand it. So for me, going back to an ancient ritual that used to exist in my heritage and reinstigating it was a powerful thing that I believe will help my daughter. But I had to do the work of learning about it and finding what had been lost, and thinking carefully about how I could recreate it, revive it. So I think knowledge is power for us. And, you know, we are being bombarded with these negative messages. We have to proactively seek out the alternative. And I'm not saying we make it up. I'm saying we go back to what already exists. You know, people were doing these things for millennia for a reason. It was grounded in knowledge. There's a wealth of history and understanding of how we connect to the planets, to the elements, to the earth. And, you know, we can see it in climate crisis, the destruction of losing that connection. So I think it's really important to understand the concepts of reinstating those ideas, but to make it reality, you have to actually know what they are and where they come from. And that's work. I'm not claiming to have exhausted it. I'm really at the beginning of that journey.
A woman is not permitted to exist in her body and love it. You could be Margot Robbie, but there'll be men criticizing her for getting pregnant. You could be Aishwarya Rai. She'd be criticized for aging. Why do we seek the permission to just be?
Yeah. And more than that, I think if you decide to push back against those norms, then suddenly you're an activist, you're brave, you represent body positivity or pro-aging. You know, many of us just want to exist in the body that we have. It's not a political statement. We don't want it to be our identity, what we're known for. But that's the reality. It's like either you conform to these ideas or you are brave because you're pushing back against them. And many of us don't want to be brave. We just want to live and be left alone to find our own peace with our body. And I think while power is constructed in this way, while women are expected to conform, expected to answer for themselves if they don't, that will always be the case. And you can't connect and you can't disconnect. And that's why I wrote this book, as someone who often writes about politics and forces of globalization and power. Writing about the body, about the intimate rituals of life and death is so connected to those other arguments because they are all one. You know, you can't disconnect our relationship from our bodies with the patriarchal system that dictates our economic reality, our expectations, our access to healthcare. So I'm really reinstating the personal experience because I know I needed to center it. I needed to give myself permission to take it seriously. And I hope that in the long run, continuing to do that will mean we don't need to seek permission anymore. Because when you think about it, it's absurd.
Girls are taught that being sexual is shameful. Boys are taught that sexualizing girls is normal. Your response?
Yes, that is true. And there's also now the competing and, you know, consequential pressure that girls are being sexualized at younger and younger ages. You know, there's so much pressure on girls to conform to very sexualized images. The people that they're given as role models, the pop stars and celebrities that are catering to their taste in music and film are themselves often hypersexualized. And yet there is still shame in actually controlling your sexuality, being unapologetic about the fact that you are a sexual being. So it's kind of the worst case scenario. You know, you're being hypersexualized when you don't want to be. When you actually consent to and seek agency in your sexuality, that's taboo. It should be the other way around. We should be protecting girls from being sexualized until they're ready and they want to take control of their sexuality. And at that point, they should have control of it. I think that while there is so much money to be made from the sexualization of women, that will never happen. I mean, the reality is it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Brands profit from exploiting female nudity and sexuality. Music feeds off the sexualization of women in its imagery. Film uses sex, even sexual violence, to shock, to draw audiences. You get rewarded for offering that. You know, I make film and TV now. I've been told that my script isn't viable because there aren't enough sex scenes in it. There's not enough violence in it. You know, that's now the expectation of how you lure an audience, that's being done at the expense of our integrity, our bodily autonomy. And again, it's so connected to power. I can't change that until the person I'm selling a show to is a woman who cares about female autonomy. Somebody who's willing to take a stand. We have to almost reprogram ourselves so that we don't need to see a violent sexual assault in a film to think it's important or powerful. We now, true crime, really gruesome stories of the rape and abuse of women is like one of the most popular forms of entertainment. I think there's something sick in a society when women who are thriving and in control are seen as taboo or problematic, but women who are victimized and abused are seen as entertainment. So, there is an abundance of examples as to what is really wrong and sick. And you can see it in the rates of violence against women and girls, that this is real. It's having real life outcomes for people's life and safety. And it has to change by telling a different story. And as a writer, I don't have a conflated sense of my power, but I do believe there is a power in telling a different story.
Absolutely. Afua, the romanticization of patterns of male violence end up as our broken skin, our broken hearts, and our broken bones.
I think there's a whole conversation to be had about men, about the way we raise boys, about masculinity. I think that's going very wrong. I feel like sometimes we're going backwards. I mean, you look at the US election and the election of a president who's been unapologetic about his use of sexual violence in the past, who's been accused of sexual violence by multiple women, who is championing a version of masculinity that removes agency from women, removes their reproductive rights, silences our voices, expects us to revert to gender roles that were never empowering. And so I think that, in a way, we are on this journey anyway by force. We don't have a choice as women. We have these bodies and we have to make sense of them. And most of us try and find peace with that. But while we are living alongside men who aren't doing that work, aren't educated in this language, are being socialized and actually in the opposite direction, then it's futile. So this has to be a conversation that involves men. And it's for mothers of boys and fathers of boys, this is also a really important conversation. Like, what are the ideas we raise our sons with? What are our expectations of them as young men? I see so often the ways we still reinforce that behavior. It can't change if we're still doing that.
Afua, my final question to you is, how can we guide women, young girls, towards their individual journey of decolonizing their own body?
There's an expression in many cultures that to change the world, you have to change yourself. I think sometimes, in these times that doesn't feel adequate, but it's true. There's a really powerful truth to it. As a mother, I realize that I can't avoid passing on some of these toxic ideas to my own child if I don't change them in myself. Even if I tell her the right things, if she sees me scrutinizing my appearance in a certain way, eating a certain way, dressing a certain way, then everything I say will be overridden by the way that I live and the choices I make. So I have to model the behavior and the change I'd like to see. And, that's a lifelong journey and we're not perfect. And we have to give ourselves grace because we are still in a system that conditions us to be part of the problem. But I chose to be on the journey. And every single person watching this or listening to this can make a choice to begin that journey or to further that journey. And, for me, that starts with seeing your thoughts, seeing your values, seeing the choices you make, really understanding the ways your programming is influencing you in ways you may not have chosen. Once you see that, you can start to change it. And it helps to read books like my book. There are so many other books now being written, films, documentaries, podcasts. I mean, the positive thing is that now we have more platforms on which to tell alternative stories and offer alternative insights. And, it's been really powerful here in Sri Lanka to have so many conversations with women here who are thinking exactly the same way, embarking on that journey themselves. And so I think it is, and you framed it beautifully, it's an individual act, but it's also collective. We can support and reinforce each other in our conversations, in our spaces, in the way that we read and consume information together and encourage each other. And I think that can be transformational.
Resistance is such a transformative act, isn't it?
Exactly, it really is.
Yeah. Afua, this was such a beautiful conversation.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your beautiful question.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
People's Platform.